This week I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be doing some material from the New Testament. The reason is that when I was going over the material that I talked about last week concerning shipping, it got me to look at part of the New Testament which has quite a bit to do with boats. Not really. Only in one book. Most of the Gospels don't talk about any seafaring effort at all. However, in the book of Acts, there is a story of a shipwreck that I have seen people say is probably about as good an account in ancient literature of a sea wreck you can imagine. Now, this comes from the fact that we have in the New Testament two books that were written by an author that we know something about, namely Luke. Luke was a Gentile, he was a Greek, he was a physician, and he was one of the early Christians. He wrote two of the books that we have in the New Testament. It's kind of interesting. There's always a little bit of controversy who wrote what book that we might have anywhere in the Bible, but nobody seems to want to dispute that Luke was the author of the Gospel, according to Luke, and in the book of Acts. Now, I want to show you a little bit from the Gospel first, just to give you an illustration of what we can expect when we get to Acts. I'm going to ask you this question. How many of you know the Christmas story of the Bethlehem and the Annunciation, the angels and all that, and the visitation at the temple? Do you know how much of that we have in John and Mark? None. You know how much of a Christmas story we have in John and Mark? None. You know how much of a Christmas story we have in Matthew? Just the story of the Magi. And that may have taken place 2 years after the birth of Christ. Everything that we know in our idea of what the Christmas story was comes from Luke. And here are some of the pictures that I have. Oh, I hit the wrong one. There it is. There's the Annunciation of the angel Gabriel telling Mary she is going to have a child. There's the birth Bethlehem story in the manger. Here are the angels. This is Anna in the temple when Jesus was a baby, Simeon, and the story of Jesus when he was 12 years old. Question one might ask is, where did these stories come from? The tradition is that Luke got these stories from guess whom? The only person that would have known it, Mary. That he might have actually interviewed Mary before he wrote the gospel. I'm not going to say anything more about the gospel, but I want to turn now to the book of Acts and some interesting things about the book of Acts. We find three references in the New Testament to Luke as a person in the epistles from Paul. These were probably epistles written when Paul was in prison. Not sure which prison, with different prisons that he was in, but there's evidence that Paul recognized Luke as one of his early disciples. One of the things that we find in the book of Acts that is fascinating is at the beginning, the first 15 chapters or so, are an outline of the early days of the Christian church, written as well as anyone could expect. Written as well as he wrote most of the Gospel of Luke. Very excellent reporting, unbelievably good reporting. From chapter 16, and particularly chapter 20 on, it takes on a different hue. All of a sudden we run into a number of things that make it rather apparent that Luke is not writing just about things that happened to Paul, but happened to him as well. Because all of a sudden, the pronoun that is often used to refer to Paul as he suddenly becomes we. And he starts to talking about us and talking about the fact that Luke is actually along with Paul when certain of these things are taking place. The first reference that we have that is referred to as a we passage is here in Acts 16. I'm not going to say too much about it. It was during the second missionary of Paul, when Paul is in the area of Troas, still in Asia Minor, when he does have a vision to come over to to Europe. I got to try to find it right there. One of the traditions is that in this vision, when somebody's calling in Paul to come to Europe, the tradition is that maybe that was Luke. I don't think it necessarily was. But there's no question that Luke was with Paul at the time that Paul did cross over and go into Greece. Is that important? Yeah, all of a sudden that took Christianity out of Asia Minor and put it partly in Europe as well. Is that significant to us? Yes. And made it a Western religion. There's one other thing that's in that section that's kind of interesting, is that he talks about a woman that is encountered that only Luke would have known about by happening to be there. The next part that involves a wee passage starts in the third missionary journey. It starts in Acts 20. As a matter of fact, from this point on, Luke is with Paul all the way through the rest of the book of Acts until maybe the last few verses. All the way through the things that happen when they're still on this third missionary journey, before they go back to Europe, before they go back to Jerusalem, and everything that happened after that. We'll take a quick look at a map here. Oh yeah. This is one of the stories that is told in Acts 20, is that at one of the meetings where Paul was preaching, Luke reports about a boy falling asleep at a window and falling out of the window, and they think he fell to his death, but Paul rescues him and he doesn't fall to his death. The reason I included this is another thing that you really wouldn't find some reporter from the outside saying anything about, but the fact that Luke was right there and saw the whole incident, it registered with him. Let's take a look at this map rather carefully. It talks about Paul's third missionary journey. It starts out in Antioch. This is rather significant. By the beginning of the third missionary journey, the Christian church had moved from Jerusalem really to Antioch. He leaves Antioch and travels through Asia Minor, quite a bit of time here at Ephesus, again in Troy, crosses over into Europe, and then he goes all the way down to Athens and to Corinth. And this is where we have some interesting passages in the book of Acts of things that happened, particularly in Athens. But now, on his way back, see the dotted lines? On his way back, he follows the same path, and he gets to Philippi. Now, maybe it is at this point that Luke joins with him. We don't really know. But we do know that he just traveled from Philippi to Troas, and now Luke is with him. Now Luke is with him, and Luke is with him throughout the rest of the book of Acts, except for this last couple of verses. Let's take a look at this journey that we have. Whoops, we stop here, we stop here, we stop here, we stop here. These are rather indicative of the fact that Luke was here and keeping a pretty good log of what they were doing on this particular boat trip. This is where we stopped first. Rather interesting, he doesn't stop at Ephesus on the way back. And you'd say, why not? Well, there were problems when he was in Ephesus before. And maybe he didn't want to go to Ephesus. But at any rate, the people from Ephesus spend some time with Paul down at this place. And Luke reports it rather completely, what he has to say to those people in Ephesus. It's almost as good as one of the epistles. Again, it's something that only Luke would have known about, that they didn't stop at Ephesus. But it's kind of interesting to look at these other little cities that he stopped at. And finally, they get on a boat that takes them all the way down to the coast, to Tyre. They stop first at Tyre. And then, if you can read this, does that look sharp enough? Ptolemais. Ptolemais is a very small little port that for some reason they stopped. At any rate, Luke does record the fact that they stopped. Do you remember last week we talked about the fact that Deborah, in the book of Judges, talks about the people of Asher taking care of their boats, and you go back to your boats, talking about a city called Acco, A-C-C-O, Acco. Acco is not mentioned in the Old Testament at that point. All that is mentioned about Acco is that it very well may have been the seaport that Deborah was referring to. At any rate, when we find out that that city was later on given to Hiram, they changed the name to Ptolemais. And for some reason they stopped. Why they stopped there, I don't know. Probably to pick up the mail to bring down to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea was a different situation completely. You recall last week we talked about the unique situation involving Caesarea. Caesarea is on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. We also talked about the fact last week that there were only one other really significant seaport on the Mediterranean coast as far as the Israelites were concerned, and that was Joppa. When Herod the Great came on the throne, sometime around 45-60 BC, one of the things that he got involved with was extensive building projects. And we talked last week about the fact that this Mediterranean coast was a rather attractive place for spending this summers. And what Herod did was to have a palace built on the Mediterranean coast. That palace is, I think, somewhere right around in here. And at the same time that he had that palace built, he had these piers built. He had these dikes built. He had these landfills that allowed for the formation of a port. And by the time we get to the era of Jesus, Caesarea was a rather important seaport as far as the Jews were concerned. It was a rather important place because of that palace as well, because we find out that the kings and the governors like to spend the summers in that palace. And we find that rather than spending their time in Jerusalem, they would rather come to Caesarea. At any rate, when Paul is coming back on the third missionary journey, he stops here at Caesarea. Stops here at Caesarea because there was already a Christian community in Caesarea. If we go back to the early days of the church, we find out that there were efforts to make a church, a Christian church in Caesarea. There was a man by the name of Philip. I think he had 4 daughters. And Paul and Luke managed to stay with this man Philip in Caesarea. While he's in Caesarea, an interesting thing happens. A guy by the name of Agabus comes into Caesarea to warn Paul, don't go to Jerusalem. Now, way back when Paul was back in Troas, way back when he started talking about going to Jerusalem, people tried to talk him out of it. Don't do that. But he wanted to go back for a very good reason. And that is one of the reasons that they hurried up and left Troas and made that quick journey through the Mediterranean to get to Palestine, to get to Caesarea. Paul had been very, very successful throughout his missionary journey in converting many, many of the Gentiles to Christianity. There was one thing that bothered him. There were Jews that were converted to Christianity, but not all Jews. There were Jews that were converted. But the Jews back home, he felt really did not know what Christ was, what Jesus was all about, and what this Christian movement that they call the Way, what it actually meant. And Paul wanted to get back to Jerusalem to bring that message that he'd been taking to the Gentiles and bring that message to the people in Jerusalem as well. But he was warned over and over, don't go to Jerusalem. You're going to have trouble when you get to Jerusalem. There are people that are very unhappy with everything that you've been doing on these missionary journeys. And they're just waiting for you to come to Jerusalem to give you some difficulties. Well, this man, Agabus, was actually from Jerusalem. And he comes to Caesarea. And he takes Paul's girdle. This is Paul's girdle. The girdle was the sash that he wore around his waist. And he binds himself with that girdle and tells Paul, this is what's going to happen when you get to Jerusalem. You're going to be made a prisoner. Don't go to Jerusalem. You got to get a drink here. Let me just say one thing. That's all Paul had to hear. Because what do you think he wanted to do? Let's go to Jerusalem. And a couple of days later, he and Luke and some of the other people from Caesarea traveled to Jerusalem. Now they get to Jerusalem at the time where apparently there was a festival. I think it might have been Pentecost. At the very beginning, Paul always wanted to get back to Jerusalem to celebrate Pentecost. But when he gets back to Jerusalem with his friends, well, things start to happen. Happened in Jerusalem, and they happened in Caesarea. Paul's return to Jerusalem and the events at Caesarea. You notice this asterisk? If this were done properly, it would take several weeks. This is one of the more interesting parts of the New Testament for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is outlined here in that there is a little bit of a storyline that is quite exciting in itself, in going from getting into Jerusalem, first of all, and getting into Caesarea. But the other thing that makes this so valuable is that during this period, what we find is that Paul says things to different people, and Luke records them almost verbatim. There are things that are very pertinent in terms of the way Paul actually thought about various things. I'll make a quick mention of that when we talk about what happened here in Jerusalem. When we get to Caesarea, it's a different story. But again, I'll not go to the details of the story, but tell you something about what's happening here in terms of what Paul has to say. But first of all, when you get to Jerusalem, we find out that Paul spends his time with his friends celebrating whatever this Jewish festival was. After a while, he and some of his friends go to the temple. Now, this was a Jewish festival, and there were a lot of Jews from the various parts of Asia Minor that came to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. They were still Jews. They were not Christians. They see Paul in the temple, and probably he has some Greeks, maybe he has Luke with him, and they get very upset. What is that man doing in our Jewish temple with these people? And they start to make a fuss about this. As a matter of fact, they make such a grand fuss that it gets to be almost a riot of the fact that those people are in our temple right now. And the Romans, who are in charge of the city at that time, in charge of the whole world at that time, the Roman, not the commander, the Roman centurion, I think it was, came out to quell that riot. I think I do have a little bit more about that here. Well, yeah, you get this written this one. Tries to calm them down. Not only does he calm them down, but he arrests Paul. He arrests him and puts him under arrest. I think I do have a picture of that. Whoops. I do have a picture that they arrest Paul. This becomes rather significant because from this point on, we do have to regard the fact that Paul is really a prisoner. And that turns out to be rather important when he gets to Caesarea as well. What Paul says, okay, I am a Jew. Let me talk to the people. Let me ask some questions to the people and talk to the people about who I am. And here we have one of those sections that you really should read for yourself. Paul tells about himself. in a way that we haven't heard before. Now, we know from chapter 9 of Acts that before Acts 9, Paul had been busy persecuting the Christians. In Acts 9, he is confronted by Jesus, asking why. Jesus asks, "Why are you persecuting me?" And Paul is converted. And then we find out in Acts 9 that Paul then does become a part of the Christian movement. When we get to Acts, when he's in Jerusalem, and he talks to people, tells us a lot more. He tells about the fact that he was born into a family that was a Pharisaic family. They followed the law very carefully. He even talks about the fact that he was educated to be a rabbi, and actually sat at the feet of Gamaliel. That was almost like saying what? I was a jayhawker. No, he was citing what was probably regarded as one of the best scholars at that time. Being taught the ways of the Pharisees, being taught the ways of following the law. Then he talks about the confrontation that he had then he talks about the fact that he followed the law so carefully that he actually was commissioned. He was commissioned by the Jews, the Jewish hierarchy, to persecute the Christians. And when he was on his way to Damascus to persecute the Christians there, that is when Jesus confronted him, and that is when he was converted into Christianity. And that was the beginning of his new life. He didn't get into the ministry right away. It took a little while, but he did become rather effective, as we see later on. He tells that story to these people, and he ends the story by mentioning the fact that when he was confronted by Jesus later on, Jesus made it very clear that what he was to do was to take this message to the Gentiles. And that was all that some of these Jews needed to hear. And there was a real uproar. And there was a riot. They talk about throwing their cloaks in the air, throwing dust in the air. And the Roman centurion had to come and rescue him. Had to rescue him and see to it that he wasn't going to be killed. He rescued him and put him in chains. And he thought, I'm going to get this whole thing settled. And decided, I'm going to find out what's going on. And he was going to flog Paul to find out what it was that Paul had done that created such a problem. And when he's about ready to flog Paul, Paul turns on this soldier, this commander. Is it right for you to flog a Roman citizen who is not guilty? Little did people know that he was born a Roman citizen. He was born in the city of Tarsus, which made him a Roman. And as a Roman citizen, it would be against the laws for anybody to flog him if he hadn't been guilty of anything. Immediately, that soldier, I think it was a centurion, went to the commander and said, "You realize that man is a Roman?" "No, I didn't realize that." They quickly rescued Paul and saw to it that he wouldn't be flogged. That got this commander kind of curious as to what to do next. He thought the thing to do next is try to find out what is this great big fuss all about? Why are these people so upset with Paul? He was not a Christian. He was really not a Jew. He didn't know what these Jews were so upset about. So he arranges to have the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body of the Jewish religion at that time. The Sanhedrin, which was composed of Pharisees and Sadducees, get together to question Paul. Here we find Paul being very, very clever. The first thing that Paul says when he's in front of the Sanhedrin, that one of the things that he believes strongly in is the resurrection, because that is what Jesus is all about, the resurrection from the dead. As a Pharisee and as a Christian, he believes in the resurrection, as do the Pharisees, but not the Sadducees. What he managed to do was to get an argument going between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and he stood on the side and watched them go at each other. it got to a point where it got to be rather serious, and they actually again had to rescue Paul from the riot that was taking place. And Paul was quickly rescued and taken into custody so that he wouldn't be harmed. After that meeting, the Sanhedrin was finished. Some of the Jews, particularly the Jews from the outside of Jerusalem, got together and said, we've got to get rid of Paul. We've got to kill Paul. And so they plotted to kill Paul the next morning. Somehow or another, Paul's nephew, this is the only time that we find out that Paul had relatives, his sister's son found out about that plot, told Paul. Paul told the commander, they're plotting to kill me. And the commander said, no, if this man is a Roman citizen, I don't let him get killed. And so he decided to transport Paul to Caesarea under protection. 75 horsemen, 400 soldiers, or 200 soldiers and 200 spearmen, 470 people escorted Paul to Caesarea. And they left Paul at Caesarea. Why bring him to Caesarea? Because that's where the governor at that time, the Roman governor Felix, was spending the time. Put this whole thing on Felix. Let Felix worry about it. Don't let me worry about it. Felix immediately tries to call some of the Jews together to find out what is going on. And he listens to what the Jews have to say about Paul, and he cannot really quite figure it out, and doesn't do anything about it, except to question Paul. He goes in to talk with Paul on various occasions. Here we find an interesting statement made by Luke. He questions Paul while Paul was still in prison, but free to go to a certain extent, but questions Paul over a period of 2 years. Luke is there the whole time as well. For 2 years, this questioning goes on. That, we believe, was approximately 60 A.D., the year 60 A.D. They know that is also about the time that Festus took over from Felix. Felix had been the governor, and now a new governor came along, namely Felix. Felix comes along. Festus tells Felix what's happening. Why don't you find out what's going on with this guy? Well, Felix decides he better try to look into that. I'm not going to say anything more about it. From there on in, what we have in Caesarea reads like an Earl Stanley Gardner mystery novel. It's all about the law and how the law is working. Festus has to worry about the law. Also comes along King Agrippa, who was king of the Jews. He comes along, and they get all enmeshed in the situation of the law. And at one point, a very strange thing happened. When Paul was being questioned, he said, you want to bring the Jews here, but the Jews have not yet really laid one hand on me that there's any reason that they should do anything to me. But I am in the court of the Romans. I'm in Caesar's court. It says, therefore, rather than worry about what the Jews have to say, I appeal to Caesar. Let Caesar decide what is to go on. Then we get a little section here where Paul talks to Agrippa. Agrippa knows a little bit about the Jews. As a matter of fact, Agrippa's wife knew a little bit about Christianity even. And here again, we get one of those great sections where Paul talks an awful lot about his background in some detail. All Agrippa has to say at the end of that discussion, one of those discussions with Paul, is, are you trying to make a Christian out of me? At any rate, Festus and Agrippa get together. They say, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing we can do about this guy. He should go free. But he can't go free. he appealed to Caesar. Then to Caesar he must go. There apparently somebody had that in their mind the whole time, and that was Paul, because Paul always wanted to get to Rome, and now all of a sudden he has a free passage to Rome. He's going to be sent to Rome along with Luke. Now we get a chapter and a half that are regarded as some of the greatest verses that we have in the Bible, because we get the story of the voyage of Paul and Luke to Rome from Caesarea. We get it in some detail. I am going to, for the most part, just read it to you. I thought about this many times, that trying to embellish in any way what was written by Luke is kind of foolish, because it is done so well. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Austin cohort named Julius. And embarking on a ship at Trium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by this man. The next day, we put in at Sidon. That was one of the main ports in Phoenicia. And Julius treated Paul kindly. And putting out to sea again, they sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia and Myra, now I can say, and Lycia, that they found it, all right. But actually what I want to look at is what we have right here. Here's a picture of Paul and getting on the boat. And this is when they're sailing off the coast of Cyprus. It's a nice day. Actually, it's probably late in the summer at this time, or early fall. But here is the trip. They started out here in Jerusalem, went to Caesarea, and from Caesarea, they went on up to Tyre, where they picked up a boat. And that boat, well, instead of going directly here, they found they had to go all the way around Cyprus because the winds weren't right. And that's why we have this roundabout trip. They mentioned these places or Luke mentions these places that they had actually stopped. And like I say, Luke was keeping a very careful log. There was a centurion found aboard the ship. We sailed for a number of days, arrived with difficulty at Cyprus, as the wind would not allow us to go on. We sailed to Salome, and we went to a place called Fair Havens. Now let's go back one slide here. Here's Fair Havens. They left, got to Fair Havens, and from Fair Havens, they managed to find another boat. Actually, I think this is mentioned in some detail. It is that much time had been lost and the voyage was already dangerous because of the fast that had already gone by. Paul advised them, saying, "Sir, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only to the cargo of the ship, but also for our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the captain and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they would reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, looking northeast and southeast, and winter there. Let's take a look at that map again. This is Fair Havens, and what they're hoping to do is to get to Crete. That's quite a journey to go from here to here. But Paul, as we are told, that Luke tells us that Paul said, that's not a good idea. It's getting late, and there could very well be some difficulty if we do that. Well, it didn't take long. When the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete coast offshore. But soon a tempestuous wind called a northeaster struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. And running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the boat. And after hoisting it up, they took measure to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they should run on Citrus, they lowered the gear and so were driven. In other words, they tried to avoid getting into trouble. But as we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to throw cargo overboard. And the third day they cast out with them with their own hands the tackle of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was abandoned. And they had long been without food. Paul then came forward amongst them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and you should not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss." Moving on. Here we actually see them throwing some of the cargo overboard. I think this next picture shows them throwing that tackle overboard. And as they had been without food, Paul then came forward amongst them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me. And now bid, take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. For this very night there stood by me an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and lo, God has granted you and all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told.'" I think I have one picture of Paul encourages the passengers. Here we had the angel talking to Paul. Paul says, "Don't worry about this. I'm going to tell you something." It shows up a little bit later. How many other prisoners do you think were on the board ship with him? I think it was 240. There were a lot of people on board this ship. But Paul is saying, don't worry. We're going to make it all right, because the angel of the Lord has told me that I will be before Caesar. But we shall have to run on some island. And when the 14th night came, and we were drifting across the Sea of Adria about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they sounded and found it 20 fathoms. A little further, they sounded again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let out 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Here we see them checking the depth. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and lower the boats under pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and let it go. This is the ones that are trying to get away. And as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food. They will give you strength, since not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God, in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And they were encouraged and ate some food for themselves. But there were on all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten, and they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now when it was day, and they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they had planned possibly to bring the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, and hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking the shoal, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was broken up by the surf. The ship fell apart. People are, and when they were out there. Okay, I just read. Then the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out this purpose. And he ordered those who could swim to throw themselves overboard first and to make it for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. So it was all that escaped to land. I think I have a few slides here of the threat of killing all the prisoners, the ship floundering, and the people cast out into the sea. There they are, trying to get ashore. There's Paul actually helping one of the Roman soldiers. That's probably the most famous picture. That's the end of the chapter. The next chapter, chapter 28, starts out, says, after we escaped, we learned that the island was called Malta. They didn't realize that Malta was a small island just south of Crete. And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and it was cold. And Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, when a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. There's the little stick. There's the viper. I'll go back one slide here. I got this out of work. When the natives saw the creature hanging on his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice will not allow him to live. He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They waited, expecting him to swell up or suddenly fall down, dead. But when they had waited long enough and saw no misfortune to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Here are a couple of pictures of the viper in Castle. I'll go over this very quickly. Now in the neighborhood of that place, there were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, a guy by the name of Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people of the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They presented many gifts to us, and when we sailed, they put on board whatever we needed. Well, what does it mean they sailed? This is Publius' father being cured. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship which was wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria, with the twin brothers as figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days, and from there we made a circuit and arrived at Phrygia. And one day the south wind sprang, and one day a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to this city. And there we found brethren and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. Finally, Paul is in Rome. Here is that last journey. This is Malta. This is where the snake episode took place. This is Sicily. This is where they got aboard another ship that took them all the way up the coast so that they could actually get into the city of Rome. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews. And when they were gathered, he said to them, brethren, though I have done nothing wrong against the people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Roman. Romans. And when they examined me, they wished me to set me at liberty because they saw no reason for a death penalty in my case. And when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge brought against me, against my nation. For this reason, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since because of the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. He is still a prisoner. Well, I'm not going to say much more, because I want to talk about something. It doesn't tell us too much more, other than that Paul was now a prisoner in Rome. Then what happened? Well, I think I can go a little bit further and show you that Paul made it clear to them that he felt his mission was to preach to the Gentiles. He does spend time preaching to people. I think I have people being taught by Paul. And he lived there 2 whole years at his whole expense and welcomed all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching of the Lord Jesus Christ quite openly and unhindered. Oops. What happened next? The last verse, which I can't show you because no, I can't. It just says, and Paul stayed there for 2 years. Then I made up this slide. What happened next? Well, nobody knows. Nobody knows what happened to Paul after that time. He was in Rome. Now, the best we can figure out, Paul went to Caesarea approximately 60, or a little bit before. When Felix comes on, it might have been around 62 or 63. And when they went on the trip to Rome, it might have been 63 or 64 AD. Now, if you remember your Roman history, you will recall that Nero was the emperor at that time. And Nero was going to be the one that Paul would see. We have no indication that Paul ever saw Nero. No indication at all. Nothing at all. What did happen to Paul? Well, we also know this. The book of Acts was written after the book of Luke. And they're pretty sure the book of Luke was not written until after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. That's 6 years later, when the Romans in the first revolt destroyed under Titus destroyed Rome, destroyed Jerusalem. Then the book of Luke was written, and Acts was written afterwards. Now we're talking about maybe 8 years. And what do we know about Paul? Nothing. There's been a lot of speculating about what could have possibly have happened to Paul. Some folks say that probably he was executed. Probably he was torn apart by the lions or something like that. Probably one of the people that had been murdered by Nero. We don't know. Others say that maybe he went to Spain. Well, there's a reference in one of the epistles that one of the epistles mentions about Paul being in Spain, but there's no evidence that he ever went to Spain. We just know nothing at all. Now, this alone makes me believe that the rest of this whole story really is the truth and it's not fiction. If anybody could make up fiction, anything like that sea voyage, certainly could have found a sufficient way to make a story about how Paul died or how Paul had perished. You know, the more I thought about this, something came to my mind, and I wonder if it comes to your mind. How many of you are thinking about something very similar? Jimmy Hoffa. Remember the situation? What happened to Hoffa? He disappeared. He disappeared completely. I looked into that. They think that he was buried under a swimming pool, or he was buried in the meadows in New Jersey, or he was buried in one of the baseball diamonds. They don't know. Nobody knows. But what was true about Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance was that The Teamsters couldn't celebrate. The truckers couldn't celebrate. Neither could say, well, we succeeded. And the rest of us could say, thank goodness we don't have to hear about Jimmy Hoffa. And we didn't for a long. And that might very well have been the situation with Paul. If you read the whole story, as I've done it now a couple of times, you find out this guy Paul was really a very controversial person. Controversial to the people. They wanted to kill him on the spot. There were people that were for him. There were people that were against him. If he had been executed in any way whatsoever, he would have been made a martyr. And the Christians would say, there is Paul, another of our martyrs. Well, we can't say that Paul was a martyr. The Jews that saw to it that he was killed could say, look, we succeeded and we killed him. And the rest of the people would say, thank goodness we don't have to hear anything more about him. And it could very well be that the reason we don't have anything more about Paul is that somehow or another he was spirited away. Maybe by some of his followers. We don't know. We don't know what happened to Jimmy Hoffa for that matter either. But it didn't make a difference. You didn't hear that much about the Teamsters and all those strikes and all that after that. And I think the same thing happened here with Paul. That people felt, well, we don't have to hear about Paul. The Jews got their, well, what did the Jews get? Well, we don't know. Well, the Christians got their, well, we don't know what they got. Leave it at that. I think it ends up in a rather interesting fashion. I did have to reach this one conclusion, however, though, and that is that when you take a look at this life of Paul and the efforts that Paul had made as a missionary and the things that happened in the latter part of his life and the notoriety that he had, it could very easily be said that he was probably about the most influential person setting history of the Western world except for Jesus himself. There probably isn't another individual that had as much influence on what happened in subsequent years, even to this very day. The other thing I think is interesting to think about is that right now, as I understand, this woman in England who wrote these goblin stories, what's the guy? Harry Potter stories. Oh. Is regarded as one of the most successful authors in one generation. Try to beat Luke. Luke has had his written material probably reproduced more than anybody else in the history, and still being reproduced regularly, and hopefully being read. Luke is a very interesting individual in that fashion, and we've been very fortunate, I think, in having these parts of what Luke had to say in our Bible. Next week, something entirely different.